prophecy lures Mannix on a deadly course, and Barnaby Jones learns that seeing is not believing. Tonight at 8:30 on Channel 2.
Bob Dunn here in the KNXT newsroom. Many products we use every day on our face, hair, hands, or bodies cause 60,000 injuries a year.
Details on Newsroom at 7.
Look, when it comes to coffee, I don't take any chances. I use MJB. Now, heaven knows, some of my friends don't really know the difference. I mean, to them, coffee is just something to drink. But I like coffee. I mean, I really get disappointed if it doesn't taste good. So I have to use MJB. Because somehow it always tastes good when it should. And I'm not the greatest cook in the world.
This is an Ortho king-size mattress. This is an Ortho convertible sofa. This is an Ortho corner group. Your choice just $118 because they're factory to you from Ortho.
Holiday on Ice, Anaheim Convention Center, last day today. For ticket information, see your local newspaper.
Hello. Here we are at the end of another year, being lied to by the calendar again. A lie that says our lives come measured in regular lengths that are cut off and dropped into the past every time we have a winter solstice. It's an endearing lie. It gives us a chance to say, what an incredible year it's been. It seems we always say that. We should have waited until now. For the year that Richard Nixon began as a man in full grasp of the presidency and ended as a man holding on to his job. For the year Spiro Agnew lost his silent majority because of his secret felony. And the year we came down to earth and found its reserves of energy really are limited. That's not all, of course. Cameras were not there to record the people who gave the right change or stayed married or said, excuse me, when the other fellow should have. But cameras did give us a collection of moments that asked our attention and even changed our lives. That's what this is, a television album.
This is a CBS News special report. "1973, a television album."
There's not much difference in pain relievers that you can see, but in your bloodstream, the differences are very real. While all three leading pain relievers reach an effective level in minutes, in the final analysis, only one of them hits and holds the highest level, Anacin. This difference is the extra pain reliever Anacin provides when you have a headache. Remember, the difference in Anacin is the higher level of pain reliever. Anacin relieves pain fast.
I keep all the things I use on my floor. You know, cleaner, shiner, stripper, right in here. Johnson's Step Saver. As I damp mop, it cleans, shines, even strips with self-stripping action. A new coat of Step Saver dissolves its old coat, loosens dirt, even black heel marks. I just mop them away. Self-stripping Step Saver cleans deep, shines bright, and ends build up. It could be all you'll need to use on your floor.
Which of these four companies backs you best? Say something except for tires. Just plain wears out on your new car during the first 12 months or 12,000 miles of ownership under normal use and service. Maybe you need a new engine and drivetrain. Well, it seems everyone covers that. But what about plugs and points? Shock absorbers, clutch linings, brake linings, hoses and belts, light bulbs? Okay, now let's say you need your wheels balanced or aligned. Or your carburetor clutch and brakes need adjusting. Or some nuts and bolts need to be tightened. But still you could be hung up unless someone has a plan to lend you a car free if guaranteed repairs take overnight. AMC Buyer Protection Plan. We back them better because we build them better.
Here is CBS News correspondent John Hart.
This year had a grand beginning for Richard Nixon. He returned to office with historic approval from his countrymen, and events went his way, too. We got out of Vietnam on his timetable, got our prisoners back on his terms. That's Bernard Kalb's story.
The military called it Operation Homecoming. These were the moments that gave it meaning. American prisoners of war, 590 in all, returning to their families. In a sense, their journey had begun a few weeks earlier with a televised announcement by the President of the United States.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
The airport at Hanoi, February 12th, the first prisoners not yet free, betraying no emotion, taking no chances. But moments later, all that changed. They were no longer prisoners of war. Aboard the plane that carried them away from Hanoi, away from their nightmare, there was jubilation. Later, many would tell stories of torture, of mistreatment in prison, but today there was only relief. The message delivered in many ways, welcome home. First stop, Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. And the first man off the first plane was Navy Captain Jeremiah Denton of Virginia Beach, Virginia. Senior officer among that first group of POWs, and thus their official spokesman. Denton set a theme that many other returning POWs would follow, expressing thanks to their Commander-in-Chief, the President.
We are profoundly grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to our nation for this day. God bless America. God bless America.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Irving Berlin at the White House dinner for the POWs. The war was officially over, but not the controversy. Bombing continued in Cambodia until August 15th, when it was ended by order of Congress. The last planes returned to their bases, but by then there was a new controversy. The disclosure that secret bombings of Cambodia had begun in 1969, deliberately concealed from the public and from much of Congress. President Nixon defended the secret bombings, said they hit only territory occupied by North Vietnam.
As far as the American people are concerned, I think the American people are very thankful that the president ordered what was necessary to save the lives of their men and shorten this war, which he found when he got here, and which he ended.
There is still fighting in Vietnam, but no American troops are dying on those battlefields. Vietnamese are dying. The Saigon government estimates 40,000 enemy killed since the January ceasefire, 11,000 South Vietnamese. His family grieves for Nguyen Van Zong, killed October 16th, the day that Henry Kissinger and North Vietnam's Le Duc Tho were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their effort to bring peace to Vietnam.
With our troops home and the prisoners back, and with a mandate to lead that he called a mandate to govern, President Nixon was the center of power. He was headmaster with the Congress, caning it with 9 vetoes, impounding $16 billion it wanted to spend. And when the Senate got curious about Watergate, he brushed it off, as Daniel Shore reports.
Once dismissed by the White House as a third-rate burglary, Watergate had become a great national inquest as Senator Ervin opened the hearings of his select committee 11 months to the day from the break-in, May 17th.
The questions that have been raised in the wake of the June 17 break-in strike at the very undergirding of our democracy. And if these allegations prove to be true, what they were seeking to steal was not the jewels, money, or other property of American citizens, but something much more valuable, their most precious heritage, the right to vote in a free election.
There were first the youthful and rueful spear carriers of the Nixon campaign, Administrator Robert Odle, Administrative Assistant Robert Reesner, who handled a wiretap file, Treasurer Hugh Sloan, who said he resisted perjury suggestions, and Scheduling Director Herbert Porter, all motivated by loyalty.
My loyalty to this man, Richard Nixon, and goes back longer than any person that you will see sitting at this table throughout any of these hearings.
The chief spear carrier, the day-to-day boss of the campaign committee, Jeb Magruder, who confessed his role in the Watergate planning and the cover-up that followed as though by reflex.
Oh, I think there was no question that the cover-up began that Saturday when we realized it was a break-in. I don't think there was ever any discussion that there wouldn't be a cover-up.
But how far up did it go? The chief accuser became John Dean, who, as the president's counsel, had been an active participant in both conspiracy and cover-up. He said it went very high to presidential aides H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, who directed him, and even higher to the president himself, whom he represented as congratulating him on September 15th when only 7 indictments were handed up.
The president told me I had done a good job, and he appreciated how difficult a task it had been, and the president was pleased that the case had stopped with Liddy.
Dean had more accusations against the president, that on March 13th he approved a hush money fund for Watergate defendants.
He asked me how much it would cost. I told him I could only make an estimate that it might be as high as $1 million or more. He told me that that was no problem.
Much of Dean's version of his talks with the president was disputed by the White House. One point was not, a warning to Mr. Nixon with large implications.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
Others told of warning the president. Former acting FBI Director Patrick Gray, who himself admitted burning evidence, said he told Mr. Nixon he might be mortally wounded by attempts to involve the FBI and CIA in the cover-up.
Do you think a reasonable and prudent man, on the basis of the warning that you gave him at that time, would have been alerted to the fact that his staff was engaged in something improper, unlawful, illegal?
I do, because frankly, I expected the president to ask me some questions, and for 2 weeks thereafter, I think it was on the 12th and again on the 28th, I asked General Walters if the president had called him. And when I heard nothing, I began to feel that General Walters and I were alarmists.
The top men of the White House and of the campaign organization staunchly defended the president, but appeared to engage in a blame-shifting duel among themselves.
Watergate didn't have the great significance that the White House horror stories that have since occurred.
All right, then would you then say that that whatever cover-up was taking place at this point, concealment or not volunteering information, had to do with actually to prevent the so-called White House horror stories rather than Watergate break-in?
This was certainly my belief, rationale of it. And I would believe that people in the White House, certainly some of them that might well be involved, certainly would have a similar interest.
There was a lot of speculation about John Mitchell and his place in all of this. I can recall at one of these meetings, Bob Haldeman saying, I wonder if we're taking all this anguish just to protect John Mitchell.
It was left to Mr. Nixon's closest and highest associate, former Chief of Staff Haldeman, to make the general defense against Dean's charges for the president and for himself.
At no time did I give Dean any instructions to cover up anything in this case. I had no personal motivation to cover up anything because I had no personal involvement, and I knew the president had no involvement.
The Irving Committee examined many witnesses, but not the president himself. Mr. Nixon refused to testify. But suddenly there arose another way of getting the president's testimony. It was revealed by a former Haldeman assistant, now Federal Aviation Administrator, Alexander Butterfield.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
What an astonished nation heard from Butterfield was that, known only to a handful, all presidential office and telephone conversations had been recorded for history. It was a history-making discovery, and from then on, the Watergate investigation was dominated by the battle for the best evidence of President Nixon's activities, his own recorded conversations. On December 19th, the committee presented the White House with massive subpoenas for 481 presidential conversations up to last month, and for bales of documents bearing on the Dairy Fund and on the Nixon-Howard Hughes connection. On these and other matters, the Watergate Committee plans hearings early in the new year. It is supposed to report by the end of February. But Senator Ervin, foreseeing a long court fight over the tapes, is already thinking of asking an extension, making this his last great cause before retirement a year from now. Whenever that report comes with its proposals to clean up political campaigns, it is likely to be overshadowed. For what started last May as the congressional investigation of Watergate may soon become a sideshow to the impeachment investigation.
President Nixon was convinced the committee was out to get him and said the Watergate case belonged in the courts. As it turned out, that's where it hurt him most. Fred Graham on the court case.
A century and a half ago, the French writer Alexis de Tocqueville observed that Americans put such trust in the law that important public issues tend to resolve themselves into legal questions and be decided in court. Nowhere has this proved more true than in the past year, as a series of court hearings brought to the surface some of the blemishes of the Nixon administration and marked a steady decline in the president's fortunes. It began in the second week of January as the 7 men who had carried out the Watergate break-in came to trial, with the Justice Department's prosecutors not claiming that anyone higher up had been involved. The Watergate 7 were all to either plead guilty or be convicted, but John Sirica, the crusty 69-year-old trial judge, kept prodding the prosecutors throughout the trial, asking why they weren't pressing for evidence against higher-ups. One of the burglars took the hint. On March 23rd, James McCord wrote a letter to Sirica charging that witnesses had committed perjury and political pressures had been brought to conceal the involvement of others in Watergate. Then in a Los Angeles courtroom, the Pentagon Papers trial of Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo furnished dramatic evidence that the stain of Watergate ran much deeper into the Nixon administration than one break-in. It was disclosed that Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, using CIA disguises, had led a team of Cubans to burglarize Ellsberg's files from his psychiatrist's office. Ellsberg had also been overheard on an illegal FBI wiretap. Judge Matthew Byrne dismissed the charges, saying the government's conduct offended a sense of justice. At about the same time, the Nixon administration achieved a dubious historic first by having 2 of its former cabinet members indicted, John Mitchell and Maurice Stans, who were accused of bribery and conspiracy. By mid-June, it was obvious that Congress would not approve Elliot Richardson's nomination to be Attorney General unless he named an independent Watergate special prosecutor. And he named a truly independent one, Harvard Law professor Archibald Cox.
My assurance when I was named, and the assurance and testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee, was that I would be given access to everything. That's the ground on which I took the position, and I expect that assurance to be honored.
One of Cox's first acts was to subpoena 9 tapes of White House conversations about Watergate, and Judge Sirica became the first judge in United States history to order a president to turn over subpoenaed records. President Nixon invoked executive privilege and said he would take the case to the Supreme Court if necessary.
It is even more important that the confidentiality of conversations between a president and his advisors be protected. This is no mere luxury to be dispensed with whenever a particular issue raises sufficient uproar. It is absolutely essential to the conduct of the presidency in this and in all future administrations.
But the president lost in the Court of Appeals, and so he attempted to remove the tapes controversy from the courts by offering a compromise and by firing Cox. But the backlash was more than the White House could stand, and the president's lawyer made a surprise announcement.
I've just informed Judge Sirica that President Nixon will comply in all respects with the order of this court as modified by the Court of Appeals. This president does not defy the law.
But soon the president's lawyers were scurrying into Judge Sirica's court again. this time to disclose that 2 tapes were absent and a third had that mysterious 18-minute buzz.
Why didn't anyone think to find out if all these subpoenaed tapes existed?
There was no cause to. We thought we were going to win the suit, and we'd never have to bother with them.
The White House's only explanation for the buzz was that the president's personal secretary, Rosemary Woods, might have accidentally hit the wrong button in the foot pedal of her recorder while reaching for the telephone. And the Rosemary stretch became a symbol of President Nixon's credibility problems in and out of court. The year ended before Judge Sirica could complete his investigation of this, but he's expected to hand down a ruling early next month, and it could give the White House a rocky send-off for the new year. By the year's end, 12 persons associated with the Nixon administration had been convicted of crimes related to Watergate, and 5 more were awaiting trial. The tough new prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, had obtained scores of White House tapes and documents after hinting that he would subpoena President Nixon again, and Jaworski was expected to obtain batches of new indictments early in the new year. Americans had always said that no man was above the law, but until 1973, it hadn't been settled that the president was subject to the courts that enforce the laws. Now it is established that the courts may order a president to obey the law as the courts interpret it, and if he refuses, it will be taken as grounds for impeachment. And that principle could prove to be one of the most important legacies of the Nixon years.
In Richard Nixon's autobiography, he saw his life in a list of 6 crises. Watergate is at least the 7th and worst. Dan Rather traces the president's year.
He began the year a winner.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will to the best of my ability.
Then all the laughter died in sorrow.
People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
In a strange, unprecedented year for the presidency, the moods of Richard Nixon reflected events. At the inaugural balls, exuberance, and rare glimpses of a euphoric, relaxed President Nixon, allowing himself a good time.
Pat's a very good dancer, and I want you to see how she can dance, so I'm going to try too. So here we go.
Public approval of him, as measured in the opinion polls, was nearly 70%. 8 months later, his rating in the polls had dropped into the 30s. His temper and frustration, as on this August day in New Orleans, was rising. The plummet had started in March, when Watergate broke full. He held then what was to be his last news conference for 5.5 months. In April, reluctantly, he cut loose his top aides.
Today, in one of the most difficult decisions of my presidency, I accepted the resignations of 2 of my closest associates in the White House, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman.
Richard Kleindienst was swept out as Attorney General.
As the new Attorney General, I have today named Elliot Richardson, a man of unimpeachable integrity and rigorously high principle.
Archibald Cox was sworn in as special prosecutor, with promises he would have full authority to investigate Watergate and related crimes. In June, Soviet Communist Party leader Leonid Brezhnev came to visit. The atmosphere, friendly and cooperative. It was a welcome break for the domestically sieged American president, this opportunity to concentrate on what he likes best, what he thinks he does best, foreign policy. But the respite was short. There were new Watergate revelations in the Senate. The president spent 8 days hospitalized in July. Doctors said it was lung trouble. Mr. Nixon came out looking tired, but sounding defiant.
Let others wallow in Watergate. We're going to do our job.
In August, the president held his first news conference in nearly half a year at his California home in San Clemente. Questions were many and blunt. The president blamed most of his troubles on the press and political enemies.
People who did not accept the mandate of 72, who do not want the strong America that I want to build, people who do not want these things, naturally would exploit any issue, if it weren't Watergate, anything else, in order to keep the president from doing his job.
In October, the president placed U.S. troops on alert in the Middle East crisis and declared that showed Watergate had no effect on him.
I should point out that even in this week, when many thought that the president was shell-shocked, unable to act. The president acted decisively in the interests of peace and the interests of the country.
But the president's popularity rating continued to drop, down to 27%, as stories of non-existent tapes and an 18-minute gap continued to puzzle the public. The House Judiciary Committee began to consider impeachment. Mr. Nixon launched Operation Candor, but as the year ended, with his ratings just beginning to inch up, the president still was trying to persuade the public that his personal finances were honest and fair.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent.
For the president, the presidency, and for all of us, that was the year that was. It has created a crisis in the presidency, the likes of which this nation never before has seen. The drama is far from over. But around Washington, at least, there is a consensus of opinion now that the climax, for better or for worse, is nearing. In Congress, inside the White House, in places and among people in between, the feeling grows that if the president survives in office through the spring, he may, if his health holds, finish out his term. But that surviving in office through the spring won't be easy, especially if the expected economic downturn becomes a recession. All sides agree that things simply cannot for long in 1974 continue as they have been for most of 73.
One politician said we had developed a post-Watergate morality. He was the same politician whose pre-Watergate morality ruined him. Roger Mudd reports.
I, Spiro Theodore Agnew, solemnly swear
that I will... Coming off the Nixon landslide election victory, Spiro Agnew took the oath in January for his second term as vice president. He was the leading contender for the Republican presidential nomination in 1976. But in August, rumors of a federal criminal investigation of his political conduct in Maryland became public.
I'm denying them outright, and I'm labeling them, and I think a person in my position at a time like this might be permitted this departure from normal language as damned lies.
Have you ever considered stepping down even temporarily until the matter's cleared up?
I have not.
By the end of September, rumor was fact. The Justice Department was presenting its evidence to a grand jury. Agnew fought back.
I want to say at this point, clearly and unequivocally, I am innocent of the charges against me. I will not resign if indicted. I will not resign if indicted.
But on October 10th, Spiro Agnew sent his letter of resignation to President Nixon and appeared in court before Judge Walter Hoffman. Agnew pleaded nolo contendere to one charge of income tax evasion, even though the judge had warned him it was equal to a guilty plea. The sentence? 3 years probation, a fine of $10,000. Spiro Agnew disappeared from public life, victim of what he called the new post-Watergate morality, but what others saw as the old American demand for righteousness in public office. 2 days later, in a festive champagne gathering at the White House, President Nixon announced his choice as the new vice president.
He is a man who has served for 25 years in the House of Representatives with great distinction.
Gerald Ford, minority leader of the House, a faithful Nixon supporter, not likely to be a charismatic candidate for president in '76, but honest, steady, and most important, liked by his fellow congressmen who would have to confirm him. Under provisions of the new 25th Amendment, it took the House and Senate almost 2 months to fill the vice presidential vacancy. But on December 6th, the House completed congressional confirmation, and that afternoon, Ford appeared before a joint meeting of the Congress to take his oath of office.
Place your hand on the Bible. And repeat after me. I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
The big question now about Jerry Ford is whether he will get the chance as vice president to use those very qualities that caused Richard Nixon to pick him. Most of the evidence indicates he will not After a week of glow and high hopes that the swearing in of Ford would help save the Nixon presidency, Ford has been on his own, without mission or message. And Mr. Nixon has returned to his Watergate-imposed isolation, rarely asking for or taking advice from Ford, concentrating mainly on saving himself. Left to his own devices, Ford has been publicly happy and accessible, visible enough to be the subject of presidential polls, and running ahead of both Kennedy and Jackson. Ford himself dismisses such sampling as unrealities, but both the country and the Grand Old Party have learned that unreality has become a fact of political life.
We lost a number of people this year whose lives had made a difference. Among the politicians, Lyndon Johnson, our 36th president, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first premier, and Walter Ulbricht, who put up the Berlin Wall. Among the geniuses, Pablo Picasso, the artist, Pablo Casals, the cellist, W.H. Auden, the poet, Noel Coward, the playwright, John Ford, the movie director. Among performers who got famous for something other than performing, Betty Grable for her legs, Veronica Lake for her hair, Joe Brown for that grin. And men of other times, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, the ace of aces in World War I, and Frank Costello, former Prime Minister of the underworld. A lot of famous people were born this year, too, and we'll have their names for you in 40 years.
Like so many others, I have arthritis. So do several of my friends. The way they talked about Exocaine sounded too good to be true.
This is Exocaine, Exocaine medicated foam, the only leading rub containing benzocaine, the fast-acting anesthetic that deadens pain up to hours at a time. Exocaine starts to penetrate immediately to temporarily deaden minor aches and pains of arthritis.
I do feel less pain with Exocaine.
Fast-acting Exocaine to temporarily deaden minor arthritis pain.
This is a wonderful time of the year for our family. And one of the things we enjoy about it is giving each other gifts. But we already have the best gift of all, the gift of good health. Of course, it helps to eat right and exercise. And we take Geritol every day. With Geritol, we know we're getting enough iron. Iron that's basic to good health, and some very important vitamins. Everybody loves to get gifts. But when you've got your health, you've already got the best gift of all.
Geritol, every day.
This CBS News special report will continue following station identification. See the Cotton and Rose Bowl parades and the exciting Cotton Bowl game between Texas and Nebraska, all New Year's Day on CBS.
Here's news you've been waiting for. Lee's Bars, Stools and Dinettes semi-annual clearance sale, when our $1 million inventory is reduced not just 5, 10, or 15%, but up to 50%. Honest to goodness savings on bars, dinettes, game sets, and breakfast nooks. You'll save to 1/2 on floor samples, cancellations, and special orders, guaranteed up to 10 years. So hurry to the big clearance sale of the year at Lee's, where you'll save to 1/2. For a store nearest you, call 213-877-1325.
Price gougers beware. A film report at 7.
"1973, a television album" will continue in a moment.
Kodak presents a whole new experience in home movie making. Listen to the talkies. The talkies are sound movies you make yourself with the new Kodak Ectosound movie camera and Kodak Ektachrome 160 sound movie film without movie lights. They're at your photo dealers now, along with the new Kodak Ectosound movie projector, so you can keep the sights and sounds of Christmas. Just ask for the talkies from Kodak.
Load a house full of furniture, unload a house full of furniture. Where does it get you? In the neck, the back, the shoulders. What are you gonna do, huh? Absorbine Jr. It's hard-working medicine, speed up circulation when you put it on. Warmth gets deep into sore, aching muscles. Loosens them up. You work hard, ache sometimes, get Absorbine Jr. Absorbine Jr. works as hard as you do. Maggie, you're beautiful.
I know.
She knows.
A few things made us look up this year. A comet, an apostrophe in space making Kahoutek possessive, and a space station where Morton Dean leads us.
1, 0.
Skylab was almost a $2.5 billion flop. Shortly after launch, convulsive aerodynamic pressures caused so much damage to the unmanned spaceship, for a while there was some doubt that astronauts would ever move in.
3, engine sequence start.
The first crew was finally launched 10 days late and confirmed the extent of damage to the Skylab. One power-generating wing had been sheared off.
Solar Wing 1 is in fact partially deployed. There's nothing left over on the other side.
The trouble blamed on designers and manufacturers, with NASA accepting its share of the blame. Working in weightlessness, Skylab crews proved themselves adept at making important repairs. Repairs that saved the mission. Was it a Skylab or a Sky Lemon? So many problems developed. Skylab, as large as a 3-room house. Comparing it with an Apollo moonship, like comparing a mansion with a motel. The primary experiment in that largest spaceship ever launched, man himself. There were some consistent results, not entirely unexpected. The men lost weight and muscle tissue. Without the tug of gravity, their hearts grew lazy. So far, doctors have not discovered any permanent physical impairments. The astronauts have snapped tens of thousands of photographs of the Earth.
Now, from Skylab, we're not going to be able to make it rain. But we think from Skylab, we can look down with suitable sensors and find areas which have high probability of water.
Earth resource photographs already in use back on Earth for a variety of purposes, including to analyze the growth patterns of cities, to track the movements of crop-killing insects, to determine the flow of pollutants into bodies of water. The astronauts looking up as well as down, photographing the sun, producing what one solar scientist called a revolution in solar physics. In what little spare time they have had, the astronauts have been rather inventive in keeping themselves and mission control amused. Jack Lausma played Superman, up, and away. And William Pogue was a bird in a space-age gilded cage. The current Skylab crew is scheduled to come home in February of next year, after a record 84 days in space, 3 times as long as the first crew, a month longer than the second crew.
The comet Kahoutek showed an historical sense of timing coming this year, reminding us of those old superstitions about comets being evil stars, bringing disasters. In fact, that's where the word comes from, disaster, evil star. Holy days were not protection. Yom Kippur was the holy day the war in the Middle East started up again, that had Israel fighting Egypt to the south and Syria to the north. Tom Fenton reports.
The unsuspecting Israeli army had been caught off balance and would pay dearly for allowing the Arabs to strike first. Quickly mobilized reinforcements moved up to the fronts while thin Israeli defense lines fell back under the Arab onslaught. In the north, the Syrians overran large areas of the occupied Golan Heights. For several days, world opinion was badly misled. While the Israeli army was issuing confident communiques, it was losing hundreds of men and tanks, even though inflicting greater losses on the attacking Arabs. The Israeli counterattack, when it began, did not produce the expected Arab rout. There were huge tank battles in classic World War II style. The Syrians, reinforced by Iraqi, Jordanian, and other small Arab elements, fought well, contesting every inch of rocky ground. The air war produced other surprises. In 1967, the Israelis knocked out the Arab air forces on the ground. This time, they had to take them in the air. But though the Israeli Air Force was able to strike deep into Egypt and Syria, hitting even Damascus, its offensive power was largely neutralized by deadly Soviet-supplied ground-to-air missiles, which knocked out many of their first-line planes. It was under this missile shield that the Egyptians carried out their precisely executed canal crossing at the start of the war. Hundreds of Egyptian tanks and up to 100,000 Egyptian soldiers crossed on pontoon bridges and boats. The so-called Bar-Lev line, manned by only 500 to 600 soldiers, crumbled, and with it, the Israeli army's reputation for invincibility. The Egyptians had never fought so well. The Israelis fell back to secondary positions in the Sinai as the Egyptians dug in and reinforced a 100-mile-long front on the east bank of the canal. Israeli reinforcements began to arrive when the Syrian front stabilized. While holding off Egyptian attacks in some of the biggest tank battles in history, the Israelis turned the tide of the war in a brilliant maneuver. Their armored forces thrust across the canal at midpoint in the gap between two Egyptian armies, destroying missile sites and wreaking havoc on Egyptian rear lines. Egypt's Soviet protectors urgently summoned Secretary of State Kissinger to Moscow, where in 40 hours a ceasefire agreement was drawn up and imposed on the Israelis. Kissinger rushed to Tel Aviv to pressure Prime Minister Golda Meir into keeping an agreement which many Israelis opposed. The United States was able to use powerful leverage on the reluctant Israelis. Its huge airlift of weapons and ammunition had saved the Israeli forces from running out of tanks and shells. A parallel operation was conducted by the Russians until both sides were fully rearmed. Israeli armored units on the west bank of the canal disregarded the ceasefire at the first signs of Egyptian violations and raced on at full tilt. By the time of the second ceasefire, 36 hours later, they had cut off the town of Suez and closed the trap on 20,000 men of the Egyptian Third Army. Hundreds of Egyptian soldiers began surrendering. Kissinger flew to Cairo and worked out another agreement which narrowly averted a new round of fighting. Again, reluctant Israelis were pressured into concessions. The documents were signed under United Nations supervision at kilometer 101 on the Cairo-Suez road.
The war altered the balance of power enough, or at least the balance of confidence enough, to get Arabs and Israelis together in their first formal peace negotiations since Israel became a state in 1948. If the war gave no clear victory, the talks brought no sure peace. But the fact they were talking at all was another fulfillment for Henry Kissinger. It was a prized year for him. Beginning with the January truce in Vietnam, sharing Nobel honors with North Vietnam's Le Duc Tho, each of them getting half the prize for something less than peace. Then the greater prize when the German refugee became Secretary of State.
And if my origin can contribute anything to the formulation of our policy, it is that at an early age, I have seen what can happen to a society that is based on hatred and strength and distrust, and that I experienced then what America means to other people, its hope and its idealism.
He met with Premier Zhou Enlai in China and Edward Heath in England, with oil sheikhs in oil sheikdoms, and stopped off in Korea, seeing King Hussein and a formal visit to Pakistan. But the Middle East dominated his travel log. In his first 3 months in office, he visited 21 foreign capitals and traveled 50,000 miles, the hardest miles coming near the end of the year in Israel and in Egypt to stop the shooting and maneuver for peace. When the fighting stopped in the Middle East, it seemed the only clear losers were us by losing Arab oil. And it wasn't just the Arabs. We were already short. Mitchell Krauss narrates.
This was Denver last July, having gasless weekends 3 months before the Arabs cut us off. What the Arabs did was make us face up to the limit we had already reached and change our ways, which were beyond our means. We began to recognize new kinds of virtues, like smallness, and certain kinds of togetherness, and certain kinds of homeliness. We were asked to cool down and slow up. The economy began to do both. The cost of jet fuel went up 345%. The airlines stopped more than 1,000 daily flights, and furlough notices went out to thousands of workers. The cost of diesel fuel went up, and in the Middle West, truckers shut down in the middle of the road. The fuel scarcity, being undeniable, made the environmentalists quite deniable, and Congress quickly approved the great oil pipeline across Alaska. Detroit lost much of its big car business. General Motors sales alone went down 25% in 10 days, and GM closed selected factories. Economists began talking about 6% unemployment next year, maybe more, maybe much more. The energy drought ended an uncertain economic year that began with a dollar flood. Traders selling dollars had to go a long way to find someone to say yes. There were more dollars overseas than anyone wanted, so we devalued them 10%, making American goods a bigger bargain. A lot of foreigners with dollars came here to spend them and invest them. The Japanese began treating the United States as an underdeveloped country, putting up office buildings and hotels, building airplane factories and hiring the locals, starting up branches here in all kinds of businesses, from cars to soy sauce, and joining the economic elite properly with a horse farm in Kentucky. Cheaper dollars did one good thing. By getting foreigners to buy more from us, it gave us a surplus in the trade balance for the first time in nearly 2 years. Some things we let them buy too much of. Grain, for instance, and soybeans, whose prices tripled by June when President Nixon ordered us to keep more soybeans at home. We've been selling more than half of them overseas. It became very expensive to raise the animals that grow on grain.
We bought bean meal last year for $80 a ton, and it is now around $400 a ton. And it just takes all the gravy out of it.
Some of the chicken ranchers gave up for a while and dumped their crops. Price controls came off, and a week-long meat boycott made meat scarce for a few days. By the end of the year, wholesale farm prices had gone up 43%. The cost of living went up 8%, food prices alone 19%. It all came home at home. The stock market was something else. Starting at an all-time high of 1051 on the Dow Jones average, the market lost $200 billion in paper value along the way. Economics isn't called the dismal science for nothing.
Make the world go away. Now, for the first time on television, the greatest hits of one of the biggest singing stars of all time. Telehouse presents the greatest of Eddie Arnold in 2 great new records. We'll turn the world around the other way. What's he doing in my world? But I really... You'll hear all the hits that made Eddie Arnold the best there is. You get 2 priceless records filled with great full-length original recordings, all for just $4.99, or 8-track tapes for only $6.99. Get yours now. Goodbye.
Send $4.99 for records, $6.99 for 8-track tape to Eddie, P.O. Box 8800, North Hollywood, California, 91608. Money-back guarantee from Telehouse.
Guerrillas set off 23 bombs in London this month and hurt 78 people there, exporting their war from Northern Ireland. But there was a difference this year in the war between Christians, as John Lawrence reports.
Europe's longest and most tragic conflict since the Second World War entered its 5th year in 1973 and claimed some 250 lives, most of them innocent civilians. And yet, despite the continued violence, the first faint signs of a peaceful solution to the centuries-old Irish dilemma appeared on the political horizon. More than 15,000 British soldiers were stationed in Northern Ireland, patrolling the battle-scarred streets of Belfast, searching homes and questioning suspects in place of the police, trying to impose law and order on an often rebellious population. Catholic resistance to the troops continued. but less frequently than in previous years, partly because of fear and partly because people were becoming emotionally exhausted by the violence. There were about 1,000 bomb blasts across the province, but the explosions which attracted the most attention were in England. Beginning in March, when a car bomb went off outside the criminal court building in London, killing 1 person and injuring over 200, scores of bombs were set in English cities as the Irish Republican Army extended its campaign to the British mainland. At the same time, the political process was being revived in Northern Ireland as voters elected delegates to a new 78-member assembly. The outcome gave 2/3 of the seats to moderate Protestant and Catholic politicians, the other third to hardline Protestants who pledged to wreck the new government. After months of tough bargaining, the moderates hammered out a unique compromise under which Catholics would share power with Protestants for the first time. At year's end, an historic conference was held outside London, bringing together the prime ministers of Great Britain, the Irish Republic, and the new coalition in Ulster. They agreed on the creation of a Council of Ireland, a major achievement that will bring about deep-seated changes in the relationship between the two Irelands, and could, if successful, bring peace someday to the tortured province where politics is religion and religion is politics.
In Latin America, where the politics is normally military, Venezuela had orderly elections and held on to its democracy. Chile lost hers. Salvador Allende was the first Marxist to come to power in the Western Hemisphere by democratic vote, but his downfall followed the same script. Ike Pappas reports.
Anti-government riots, demonstrations, and a crippling truck driver strike paralyzed the Chilean economy just before the coup and brought all activity in the country to a standstill. Some thought there was a peaceful way to reconcile the nation's problems. The military did not. And on the morning of September 11th, sent planes and tanks to bring down the elected government of Marxist President Salvador Allende. With troops storming the Moneda, the presidential palace, Allende apparently killed himself, but his death did not satisfy the military junta, which seized political control. What followed was an attempt to eliminate all opposition to the new rule, either from people or from ideas. Thousands of persons, many of them Allende's friends and political allies, were rounded up. There were subsequent reports of wholesale executions and tortures, all denied by the military. At the same time, troops swept homes, destroyed libraries, burned books, some of which had nothing to do with Allende, Marxism, or even politics. Chile today remains in the firm grip of the generals, who promised to return it to constitutional rule someday, to hold elections someday, to give the government back to the people someday. But at the same time, they strongly suggest this may not be for years to come.
In Greece, the military government there was thrown out and replaced by a more military government. In the games we played, well, that a few of us played and most of us watched, some things stood out because of their quality or because of their quantity.
There was quality and quantity in the Super Bowl, the Miami Dolphins doubling the Washington Redskins. The Dolphins ending a 17-game season undefeated and untied. Washington's 7 was a gift from Garo Yepremian, who usually kicks field goals, fielded a failed goal, and tried to pass the ball. Washington took it, but it was a consolation prize. In Indianapolis, the 500 became the 332, shortened by rain and revulsion. One driver was killed. A pitman was killed by a rescue truck. And in a second crash, another driver was terribly burned, making it hard to remember who won. The hit of the year closed in Oakland, the New York Mets mushing their way through the national wilderness right up to the 7th game of the World Series, where Reggie Jackson's home run knocked them out and the Oakland A's into their 2nd World Championship. Jackson became the most valuable player in the American League and in the series, too. We hate to mention it, but something silly makes us. The silliness of the Billie Jean King Bobby Riggs promotion.
She carried into the Astrodome on a sedan chair. He looking himself in a pram, proving a great woman player can beat a good 55-year-old man while making a lot of money. The best performer of the year was the big chestnut horse, Secretariat, here winning the Belmont Stakes by 31 lengths, the first winner of the Triple Crown in 25 years, leaving records at Belmont and the Kentucky Derby, earning $1 million, preparing now for a life at stud, having been syndicated for $6 million. That's a record, too. The thing to remember about albums is that they are not history books. They have too many pictures, for one thing, and they are incomplete for another. It's hard to photograph some of the most important things. A politician's character, for instance, or a country's faith in itself, or loss of it. A survey commissioned by the U.S. Senate shows a majority of Americans are finishing this year feeling the country's in deep trouble. In this case, faith follows reason, and there's not much reason to believe that new years will bring new times. This year began with an inaugural address that spoke of confidence in hope. Hope remains. The poll that shows the presidency is now our least trusted institution confuses the office with the occupant. A number of people, including the president's friends, have asked him to resign, but nobody has even suggested the office be abolished. Maybe the lesson of this year is that we are not yet a model of perfection in government, but are still, as George Washington saw us, an experiment in liberty. In a model, failure seems disaster. In an experiment, it is simply a way of learning something. We'd like to close our album with a favorite picture of human nature this year, taken at the United Nations in October. Saudi Arabia's Ambassador Jamil Baroudi was asking the UN to prevent a death sentence on a communist in Chile. Chile's ambassador, Bazan Davila, was standing beside Baroudi.
We have no jurisdiction.
There is no sentence. You are wrong. You are Tacido Loco. You are a fool. No sentence. That's what I want to say to the General Assembly. That's what I want to say.
I am a fool. You are a fool.
It's fool.
Who is a fool? Get
saying.
to your place. Let me
What you are
finish.
saying.
Since you say I am a fool, say I apologize. You said I am a fool.
I excuse
Yeah, say
myself.
I apologize.
I apologize to you, but
Say I apologize here.
let me see.
Say I apologize.
To tie this way, yeah?
Say I
It's not
apologize.
the way to speak.
Yeah, let me finish.
You are saying lions here. You are lying here. If you accept...
Get out of here.
If you accept the idea...
Get out of here.
Which is my place? Where can...
Your place
is here.
is right
Then
here, but don't say I'm a fool. Shame on you. As a person, not as a Chilean, I respect Chile. Never have I been told I'm a fool. Never mind. Here, shake hands.
No, I don't shake your hand.
Okay, never.
The one occasion we are sure of, the diplomats said exactly what they meant. Incidentally, do you realize that 1973 came in with some relief? That 1972 was finally over? Anyway, Happy New Year. Good night.
There's a spirit going around at United Airlines. We call it friendship service. The friendly skies of your land. Have you seen the other side? It's a ticket in less than a minute to keep you out of lines. An extra roomy closet to keep you wrinkle-free.
Got so much to give.
Mother country. On most flights, a table for two in coach.
Don't let your good land pass you by.
Pass you by. Friendship service. Good reason more people choose the friendly skies than any other airline in the land.
Proud beneath the skies.
Come along, sing the song.
People, now's the time.
Friendly skies of your land, United
CBS News Special Report, 1973, a television album with correspondent John Hart.
CBS News looks at the Arab-Israeli propaganda war, solar energy, the effect of midget football on youngsters in the season premiere of 60 Minutes, next Sunday at 6, 5 Central Time on CBS.
The man Americans admire most arrives at Los Angeles International Airport in about half an hour. The federal government sets up a hotline to hear motorist complaints, and the cowboys have a rough day. I'm Bob Dunn, and this is the KNXT Newsroom. I'll be right back with all the day's news, including film of what an ore house looks like after it's been hit by a firebomb, and what a ship looks like after it's been hit by another ship.